What if the prayer you've said 10,000 times was never meant to be said at all, but lived? What if one word inside it has stumped scholars for 2,000 years, and nobody ever told you Matthew 6 hides something, and once you see it, you can't unsee it? Pastor Daniel Brooks stood at the back of his own sanctuary on a Sunday morning in October and heard 300 people say something beautiful without meaning a single word of it. "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The sound was perfect. That was the problem. 300 voices, one rhythm, not a syllable out of place. It rolled through the room like a wave that had learned to move without water. Daniel closed his eyes and listened harder, and what he heard underneath the words was silence. He'd been preaching in that building for 19 years. He knew these people. He knew Ray Dawson in the third row who'd buried a son. He knew Marjorie Klein, 81, who still walked to church in the rain. He knew the young couple in the back who came because her mother made them. And every one of them could recite the Lord's Prayer from memory before they could tie their own shoes. That morning, for the first time, that terrified him. After the service, his associate, a young man named Caleb, found him sitting alone in the front pew with the lights half off. "You okay, Pastor?" "Ask me something," Daniel said. "What?" "Ask me what the Lord's Prayer means." Caleb laughed. Then he stopped laughing because Daniel wasn't smiling. It's the model prayer. Jesus taught it to the disciples, Matthew 6. "That's what it is," Daniel said. "I asked what it means." Caleb opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood there in the aisle with his hands in his pockets, and after a long moment he said quietly, "Huh?" "Yeah," Daniel said. "Huh." That was the beginning. He went home to a house that had been too quiet for 4 years. He made coffee he didn't drink. He sat down at the kitchen table with a Bible he'd owned since seminary, its spine cracked white, and he opened it to Matthew chapter 6. The way a man opens a letter, he's already read 100 times expecting nothing. He read the whole prayer in about 11 seconds. Then he sat back and said out loud to nobody, "Why these words?" It was the question that would not leave him alone for the next 7 months. Because, here's the thing, Daniel had never let himself admit from the pulpit Jesus had one shot. The disciples came to him and said, essentially, "Teach us to pray." They didn't ask for a lecture. They asked for a method. And the Son of God, who could have said anything, who had the whole language of heaven available to him, gave them 66 words in English, fewer in Greek. 66 words to summarize how a human being talks to the God who made the stars. Nothing in there is accidental, not one word, not the order, not the pronouns. And that was the first crack in the wall, the pronouns. Daniel had read Our Father 10,000 times. That night, sitting at his kitchen table at 11:40 p.m., he saw it for the first time, really saw it, and he actually pushed his chair back from the table. Jesus didn't say, "My Father." He could have. He had more right to those words than anyone who has ever lived. He said, "My Father," elsewhere. He said it in the garden. He said it on the cross. But when he taught ordinary people how to pray, farmers, fishermen, tax collectors, women whose names nobody bothered to record, he said, "Our." Daniel picked up the phone and called Caleb at midnight. "Do you know what time it is?" "Why, our," Daniel said. "Pastor, why our?" Caleb. He's teaching individuals. Each man prays alone, in his room with the door shut. He literally says that 4 verses earlier. Go into your room, shut the door. Pray to your Father in secret, alone. And then alone, behind a closed door, he tells them to say, Our. The line went quiet. I never noticed that, Caleb said. Neither did I, said Daniel. For 19 years. Here's what it means, and it's bigger than most people are ready for. Jesus was saying you cannot approach God privately without dragging the whole human family in with you. You can lock every door in your house, and you still can't get God alone. He shows up as our Father, which means the man you can't stand, he's in the room. The woman who lied about you. The son who won't call. The brother you haven't spoken to in 11 years. You want a private audience with God. There isn't one. There's a family table, and he seats you next to the people you'd rather not sit next to. Daniel put that in his notes and underlined it twice, and then sat there feeling something cold move through his chest because he knew exactly who was sitting next to him at that table, and he hadn't spoken to the man since the funeral. But that wasn't the discovery that broke him. It was the second word, Father. Daniel had grown up with a father who drank, not a monster, worse in a way, a ghost, a man who came home and filled a chair and said nothing. Daniel was 53 years old and could not remember his father ever saying he was proud of him. He'd preached, God is your Father, 1,000 times, without ever once stopping to ask what that sentence did to a person who'd had a bad one. And then it hit him the people on that hillside had bad fathers too. That's the part nobody says. Jesus wasn't speaking to a crowd of well-adjusted people from stable homes. He was speaking to first-century peasants under Roman occupation. Half of them had fathers who'd been killed or crushed by debt or broken by the same empire that would eventually crucify him. Jesus knew that. He said Father anyway, not because their fathers were good, because God is. Daniel wrote in the margin, he's not comparing God to your father. He's correcting your father with God. Then he stopped writing and put his head in his hands. The next Sunday, he stood up and did something he'd never done in 19 years. He put his notes down. I want to try something, he told them. I'm going to say the first 2 words of the Lord's Prayer, and then we're going to stop. That's it. 2 words. And I want you to sit with them for 1 full minute. You could feel the room resist. 300 people who came for a sermon and got homework. Our Father, Daniel said. And then he was quiet. 10 seconds in, somebody coughed. 20 seconds in, a baby fussed and got carried out. 30 seconds in, the room changed. Daniel felt it happen the way air changes before a storm. People stopped shifting. Somebody in the middle rows started crying quietly, the kind of crying a grown man does when he's fighting it and losing. At 50 seconds, Marjorie Klein, 81 years old, said out loud in a voice that carried, I've been saying that my whole life. Daniel said, Yes, ma'am. No, she said. You don't understand. I've been saying it my whole life. Her hands were shaking on the pew in front of her. I never once thought he was actually listening. Nobody moved. And Daniel Brooks, who had a seminary degree and 19 years in the pulpit and a sermon prepared, stood in front of his church with absolutely nothing to say. That night, he made a decision that would consume the next 7 months of his life. He was going to take the Lord's Prayer apart, line by line, word by word, not the way he'd learned it in school where everything gets explained and filed away. The other way, the dangerous way, where you ask a question and let it hurt. And the questions were already lining up. Why does God's kingdom come before daily bread? Why do people get to ask for food only in verse 11 after 3 verses about God's name and God's will? Any decent salesman knows you lead with what the customer wants. Jesus buried the need in the middle. Why is forgiveness the only line in the entire prayer that comes with a condition attached as we forgive our debtors? And why did Jesus double back after the prayer was over to say it again harder, and the one that kept him awake? What is the word? Because there's a word in the Lord's Prayer sitting right in the middle of the most familiar sentence in it that appears nowhere else in the Greek language. Not in the Bible, not in Greek literature, not in a shopping list, not on a tombstone, not in a play or a letter or a legal document. 2,000 years of scholarship and the greatest minds in church history have never agreed on what it means. You say it every time you pray. Millions do. And nobody, not Jerome, not Origen, not one of them has ever been certain what Jesus meant by it. Daniel found that out on a Tuesday night in his study, reading a footnote in a commentary so old the pages were coming loose, and he read the sentence 3 times before he believed it. Then he set the book down very carefully, like it might go off. He said out loud in an empty house, "You've got to be kidding me. This is what that man spent 7 months chasing, not theory, not theology for its own sake. He was a widower in a small Ohio town who'd buried his wife 4 years earlier and had been praying words he suddenly realized he'd never understood, and he wanted to know before he died what Jesus actually handed the human race that day on the hillside. What he found changed how he prayed. It changed how he forgave. It changed what he asked God for. And it starts with a crowd on a hill, a group of religious men praying loudly on a street corner, and a carpenter's son who looked at all of it and said something so blunt that the people who heard it never forgot it. He told them they were doing it wrong. All of them. Every last one. They were doing it wrong, and he said so to their faces. Daniel found that verse on a Wednesday and couldn't get past it. 4 verses before the prayer even starts, Jesus does something that should stop every religious person cold. He doesn't open with encouragement. He opens with an accusation. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. Daniel read it again. Then he called Caleb because he'd started calling Caleb about everything. Do you know what that word means? Hypocrite, fake, pretender. It's a stage term, Daniel said. It's a Greek theater word. It means an actor, a man wearing a mask performing lines for an audience. That's what Jesus called them. He looked at the most religious men in Jerusalem, men who prayed 3 times a day, men who knew the law by heart, and he said, "You're acting." Caleb was quiet a second. "That's brutal. It gets worse," Daniel said. "Listen to what he says next. They have received their reward in full. Not they'll be punished, not God's angry. He says they got paid. Somebody watched them pray. Somebody was impressed. That's the check. That's it. That's the whole payment cashed, closed, done." "Pastor, they got exactly what they were praying for," Daniel said. "An audience, and God let them have it." He hung up and sat there a long time, because he knew, And this is the part he'd have given anything, not to know that he'd prayed like that. He'd prayed at hospital bedsides with one ear on how it sounded. He'd prayed at potlucks in that voice, that pastor voice, the one that drops half an octave and adds Lord every 4 words. He'd prayed over his own wife's casket, and even then, some small, rotten piece of him had been aware of the people watching. He wrote it in his notebook, and it looked ugly on the page, I have been paid in full my whole life. That's when he started reading the crowd instead of just the words. Because Jesus didn't hand this prayer to seminary students. He handed it to people standing on a hillside outside Jerusalem, and Daniel started asking who they actually were. Fishermen with cracked hands, farmers who owed money they'd never repay, mothers who'd buried children most of them had in that world. That was normal. Day laborers who didn't know if they'd eat that night. And every single one of them lived under Rome, under soldiers who could commandeer their labor, their donkey, their back on a whim. And there was no court, no appeal, no recourse. These were not people with spare time for religion. That's the part we get wrong, Daniel told Caleb over coffee that Friday. We picture a peaceful crowd on a nice hillside, Sunday school flannel graph. These people were exhausted, they were occupied, they were broke. Half of them were there because they'd heard he could heal, and they had somebody at home who was dying. So, why give them a prayer? Caleb said. Why not give them bread or a revolution? Daniel set his cup down. That's the right question, he said. That's the question. Because they'd already had religion. That was the thing. They weren't godless. Jerusalem was drowning in religion. There were prayers for waking prayers, for eating prayers, for washing your hands. There were men on the corners who prayed so long and so loud that the whole street stopped. And Jesus looked at all of it and said it was theater. Then he said something that should have gotten him killed on the spot. Go into your room. Shut the door. Daniel underlined it so hard the pen went through the page. Do you understand what he just did? He said. In a culture where prayer was public, where holiness was measured by how visible it was, he told them to close the door. He took prayer away from the temple and put it in a back room in a peasant's house. He said, the holiest thing you will ever do, nobody will ever see. Caleb said, that's the opposite of everything we build. Yeah, Daniel said. It is. And then, having sent every one of them into a room alone behind a shut door with nobody watching, he told them to say, "Our." Daniel had already seen it, but he hadn't seen the why, and the why landed on him at 2 a.m, like a hand on his shoulder. You cannot say, "My Father," in that room. He won't let you. The moment you close the door and get God completely to yourself, the moment you finally have Him alone. No audience, no performance, just you. The first word out of your mouth is a word that makes room for somebody else. Our, which means the man who cheated you is your brother. Which means the woman who walked out is your sister. Which means the person you have quietly written off, the one you've decided is beyond it. God is their Father too, and He's not taking your recommendation on the matter. Daniel wrote, He locks you in a room alone and then fills it with everyone you've been avoiding. He stared at that sentence until his eyes burned. Then he did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He got out an old address book, a paper won his wife's handwriting on half the pages, and he found a name and a number, and he sat with the phone in his hand for 11 minutes. He didn't call, Not that night, but something had started. The next Sunday, he stood up and told them the truth. "I've been lying to you," he said, "not on purpose. But I've been telling you God is your Father like that's good news, and for some of you that's the worst sentence in the Bible." You could hear the room stop breathing. "Some of you had a father who hit you," Daniel said. "Some of you had one who left. Some of you had one who stayed and might as well have left. And I stand up here and say, 'Father,' like it's a warm word, and you nod, and you go home, and you never tell me that word has a scar on it." In the fourth row, a man Daniel had known for 12 years, Ray Dawson, who'd buried a son, put his face in his hands. "So, let me say the thing I should have said 19 years ago," Daniel said. Jesus was not speaking to people with good fathers. He was speaking to a crowd where half the men had been broken by Rome, and the other half had broken their own families trying to survive it. He knew. He knew exactly what that word cost them. He came down off the platform, and he said it anyway, because he wasn't saying God is like your father. He was saying your father was supposed to be like God. One of them is the original, and it isn't the one who raised you. Somebody in the back said, "Amen." And it wasn't the polite kind. After the service, Ray Dawson waited until the room was almost empty. He was a big man, 68 hands like tools, and he stood in the aisle turning his hat over and over. "Pastor, Ray, my old man died in 91. Ray looked at the floor. "I didn't go to the funeral." Daniel waited. "Been telling myself 40 years that was the right call." Ray's jaw worked. "And I sit in that pew every Sunday and say our father and I never once, not one time, connected the two." And now, Ray laughed short and hard with no humor in it at all. "Now I can't say it without gagging." "Good," Daniel said. Ray's head came up. "Good. Ray, for 40 years you've been saying that word with nothing behind it. Now it costs you something." Daniel put a hand on his arm. "That's not it breaking. That's it working." Ray stood there a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "I don't know how to do that." "Neither do I," Daniel said. "I've got a brother I haven't spoken to since Ellen's funeral. 11 years before that, we had a fight over money. 11 years. And I've been standing up here every week telling you people about grace." Ray blinked at him. "You? Me?" "Well, hell, Pastor." Ray put his hat on. "That's the first useful thing you've said in years." And Daniel laughed, actually laughed out loud for the first time in longer than he could remember. But that night, alone with the book open, he came to the next line, and the laughing stopped. Because after our Father who art in heaven, Jesus doesn't go where anyone would go. Not one word about the crowd's hunger. Not one word about Rome. Not one word about the sick, the dying, the debt, the fear. Nothing about a single thing those people had actually walked up that hill carrying. Instead, he says, "Hallowed be thy name." Daniel sat back. They came for bread. He gave them a name. They came for rescue. He gave them worship. And every instinct Daniel had as a pastor, every instinct anyone has as a human being, screamed that this CS was backwards. You meet people where they are. You address the need. You don't stand in front of starving people and start with theology. Unless Jesus knew something about human beings that nobody wants to hear. Unless the order isn't an oversight. Unless the order is the whole point. Daniel looked at those 3 lines. The name, the kingdom, the will sitting there ahead of, "Give us this day our daily bread," and he felt the floor tilt because he suddenly understood that the Lord's Prayer wasn't just telling him what to pray. It was telling him what he'd been putting first his entire life. And it wasn't God. It wasn't God. It had never been God. Daniel wrote the sentence down at 1:15 in the morning and then sat there staring at it like it belonged to somebody else. Every prayer I have prayed for 53 years started with me. He tried to find one that didn't. He went back through his whole life looking for a single prayer that opened with anything other than a request, a complaint, or a bargain, and he couldn't find one. Not one. Not as a boy. Not in seminary. Not in the hospital hallway at 3:40 in the morning 4 years ago, when the doctor came out and Daniel already knew from the man's face. Especially not then. That prayer had started with why, and it had gone on for 8 months. He called Caleb the next morning before 6. "You have got to stop doing this," Caleb said. "Name 3 things you asked God for this week." Caleb groaned. "Pastor, 3 things." There was a rustling sound, a man sitting up in bed. "Fine, the transmission, my mom's biopsy, and—" He stopped. "And what?" "And for the church to grow," Caleb said. "So I'd have something to put on a resume." Daniel almost dropped the phone. "You said that out loud. You asked." "Caleb." Daniel was laughing, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Do you hear what we just did? You listed 3 things, and every one of them was a circumstance. Not one of them was God. We don't pray to God. We pray at Him. He's the vending machine, and prayer is the dollar." The line went quiet for a while. "So, what's the alternative?" Caleb said. "Don't ask for stuff. Just my mom's got a biopsy Thursday, Pastor. So if the answer's don't ask, I'm gonna need you to say that real slow." And that stopped Daniel cold, because it was the right pushback. It was the pushback anybody with a real life would give. "No," he said slowly. "That's not it. That's not it at all. Because Jesus does tell them to ask. It's right there in verse 11. Give us this day our daily bread. He's not against asking. He commands asking. He just refuses to let them start there. Daniel spent the next 3 weeks on 3 lines. 3. 12 words in English. And what he found underneath them nearly took his legs out. Hallowed be thy name. He'd said it 10,000 times without ever asking what it meant, and when he finally looked, he found that hallowed isn't a description. It's a verb in the imperative. It's a request, which makes no sense on its face. You're asking God to make His own name holy. His name is already holy. It's the definition of holy. What exactly is a man in Ohio supposed to add to that? He brought it to Caleb over coffee, and Caleb, to his credit, said the obvious thing. "So it's pointless." "That's what I thought," Daniel said. "For 3 weeks. And now—" Daniel turned his cup around on the table. "It's not asking God to make His name holy," he said. "It's asking God to make His name holy in me, in the place where it isn't. Because His name is holy in heaven, and it's holy in the mouths of angels, and it is not holy in the way I say it at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, when I stub my toe. His name is the one thing in the universe that's completely safe from me, and I've spent my whole life treating it like a punctuation mark." Caleb set his cup down very slowly. "So the first thing Jesus tells us to pray for," Daniel said, isn't a thing at all. It's a reordering. He's saying before you open your mouth about your life, get one thing straight, who he is and who you're not. That's... Caleb stopped. Say it. That's kind of terrifying. Yeah, Daniel said. It is. And then came the second line. And the second line is where Daniel found out that the Lord's Prayer has teeth. Thy kingdom come. 3 words. Everybody says them. Daniel had said them at weddings and funerals and Little League banquets. He put down his pen and thought about what those words actually cost a man standing on a hillside under Roman occupation. Daniel said it out loud in his kitchen, Thy kingdom come, and for the first time in his life, the words had weight. They're not decoration, he told the church that Sunday. He'd stopped using notes entirely by then. You're asking for a regime change. You're asking for every other kingdom to fall. And here's what nobody tells you, so I'm going to tell you. He looked out at them. 300 faces. The kingdom you're asking him to overthrow is yours. Nobody moved. You've got a kingdom. Everybody does. It's got borders, it's got laws, and you're on the throne. Your money, your schedule, your family, your reputation, your right to be angry at whoever you're angry at. And every Sunday you sit here and politely ask God to invade it. Daniel's voice dropped. And most of us are counting on him not to take us seriously. In the 4th row, Ray Dawson didn't move a muscle. When you say, Thy kingdom come, Daniel said, you are saying my kingdom go. There's no version where both stay. There's not room. That's what a kingdom is. Somebody's Bible hit the floor and nobody laughed. So if you've been praying that prayer for 40 years and your kingdom's still fully intact, every wall standing, every grudge in place, every dollar still yours. He let it sit. Maybe you haven't been praying it. Maybe you've been reciting it. And there's a difference, and God knows the difference, even if we've all agreed not to. The room was so quiet, Daniel could hear the heat kick on. Then Marjorie Klein, 81, 4 rows back, walked to church in the rain, raised her hand. Daniel blinked. Marjorie, you don't have to... Pastor, she said, what if you're afraid of what he'd take? And Daniel Brooks, standing in front of his whole congregation, felt the question go into him like a splinter, because that was the question. That was the entire question. That was the thing he'd been circling for 4 years with a Bible in his hand and a wall around his heart. Then you say the 3rd line, he said, and you find out if you mean it. Thy will be done. He didn't preach it that morning. He couldn't. He told them he'd come back to it, and he closed in prayer, and he went home and sat in a house that had been silent since 3:40 in the morning 4 years ago, and he faced the sentence he'd been running from since seminary, because he'd prayed Thy will be done over Ellen's hospital bed. He'd prayed it with his hand on her arm at 2 a.m. while the machine did the breathing. And he had not meant one syllable of it. He'd meant heal her. He'd meant your will be done, as long as your will is what I already decided it should be. He'd meant it the way everybody means it, as a spiritual formality you tack onto the end of a demand so it sounds humble. And when the answer came back, no, something in Daniel Brooks had quietly closed, and he'd gone on preaching for 4 years with a locked room inside him. He said it out loud in the kitchen. To nobody. To him. I didn't mean it. And then, because a man can only carry a thing so long, I still don't. He put his head down on the table, and cried like he hadn't cried at the funeral, because at the funeral there'd been 300 people watching, and he'd been paid in full. Here's what he found on the other side of it, and it's the thing this whole story turns on. He'd always heard "Thy will be done" as surrender in the sense of defeat. Hands up, give in. God's going to do what God's going to do, so brace for it. That's how most people hear it. That's why most people hate it. It sounds like a prayer for people who've stopped fighting. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He adds 5 words that change the entire meaning, and Daniel had skated over them 10,000 times. On earth, as it is in heaven. That's not defeat. That's an invasion. Nobody in heaven is grimly enduring God's will. Nobody up there has their hands up in resignation. In heaven, God's will is the good thing happening. It's not the tragedy. It's not the cancer. It's not the 3:40 a.m. hallway. Heaven is the place where nothing is broken, and Jesus is telling a crowd of broken people to pray that that would come down here. Which means Daniel realized, sitting up at his kitchen table, with his face wet, "Thy will be done," was never a prayer to accept the worst thing. It was a prayer to fight it. It was a prayer for the hospital to be less like the hospital and more like heaven. For the family to be less like the family and more like heaven. It was never asking him to make peace with a broken world. It was recruiting him to war against it. Daniel sat back and said, "Oh." Just that, just oh. 4 years. 4 years he'd been angry at a prayer he'd never once read to the end of the sentence, and it was 2:40 in the morning, and he was 53 years old, and he picked up his wife's address book and found his brother's name in her handwriting and looked at it for a long, long time. Then he did the only thing left to do. He read the next line. He read the next line, and there it was. The word. "Give us this day our daily bread." Daniel had read that sentence since he was 6 years old. It was the easy line, the one everybody understood. Bread, food, ask God for supper. Even a child gets it. Except the commentary on his desk said the word wasn't daily. There is no word for daily there. There never was. The Greek word Jesus used is epiousios, and Daniel had read the footnote 3 times on a Tuesday night before he believed it, and here is what the footnote said. It appears nowhere else, not in the rest of the New Testament except the parallel in Luke, not in the Greek Old Testament, not in Homer, not in Plato, not in Aristotle, not in a business ledger, not in a love letter, not on a gravestone. Archaeologists have dug up mountains of ordinary Greek receipts, complaints, shopping lists, a soldier writing home to his mother, and the word is not in any of them. 2,000 years. The greatest scholars in the history of the Church. Jerome, who translated the whole Bible into Latin and had to make a decision about this word, and admitted he wasn't sure. Origen, 300 years after Christ, writing that, as far as he could tell, none of the Greeks had ever used it, and it looked like the evangelists had made it up. Made it up. Daniel said out loud in an empty house, "You've got to be kidding me." He called Caleb the next morning at 6:15. "I want you to know," Caleb said, "that I've started sleeping with the phone in the other room, and it doesn't help. There's a word in the Lord's Prayer that doesn't exist." A pause. "That's not a sentence." "Epiousios," Daniel said. Verse 11. We translate it daily. It doesn't mean daily. Nobody knows what it means. Jerome didn't know. Origen didn't know. It shows up in this prayer, and then it disappears from the human language forever. Okay, Caleb said slowly. So what do the scholars think? That's the thing. They've had 2 millennia, and they've got 3 answers, and they can't agree. Give me the 3. 1, bread for existence. Bread you need to keep breathing. The bare minimum. Daniel was pacing now. Caleb could hear it. 2, bread for tomorrow. Give us tomorrow's bread today. That one's strange. It's more than strange. Think about who he's talking to. Day laborers, men who got paid at sundown, and if they didn't work, their kids didn't eat. You know what those men wanted more than anything on earth? Tomorrow's bread. In their hands. Tonight. Because then they could sleep. Caleb didn't say anything. And 3, Daniel said, the one Jerome went with. He translated it supersubstantialem. Supersubstantial. Bread that's more than bread. Bread from above. So which is it? Caleb, Daniel stopped pacing. That's what I've been chasing for 3 weeks, and I think the answer is that the question's wrong. Because here's what hit him at his kitchen table, and it took his breath. Jesus had every ordinary Greek word for bread available to him. Every one. He could have said, "Give us bread," and every person on that hill would have understood, and nobody would have argued about it for 2,000 years. He didn't. He reached for a word that didn't exist and put it in the one prayer he knew the whole world would say. He built a mystery into it on purpose, Daniel said. He put a word in there that you cannot exhaust. You can't file it. You can't master it. You say that line every single day of your life, and you never quite own it. Why would he do that? And Daniel said the thing he'd write on the inside cover of that Bible a week later. Because that's what dependence feels like. There was a long silence on the line. Look at what he asks for, Daniel said. Not wealth, not a storehouse, not a year's supply, not security. He teaches the poorest people in the Roman Empire to ask for enough, for today. And he wraps it in a word so slippery you can't nail it down, so that every time you say it you have to come back and ask again. That's, Caleb exhaled, that's kind of cruel. No, Daniel said. That's manna. And he heard Caleb get it. He actually heard it over the phone, a small sound like a man being hit. Because that's the whole story of Israel in the wilderness. God rained down bread and told them, take today's. Don't store it. Don't hoard it. Come back tomorrow. And the ones who tried to keep it overnight, who tried to build a little security so they wouldn't have to trust him again in the morning, it rotted. It bred worms by sunrise. God has never once given his people a year's supply, Daniel said. Not in the desert, not in Matthew 6. He gives today, and he does it because he doesn't just want to feed you. He wants you back tomorrow. Pastor, Caleb said, my mom's biopsy is Thursday. Daniel closed his eyes. I know. So, what do I pray? Give me enough. What's enough when it's your mother? Enough for Thursday, Daniel said. That's it. That's all he's promising. Not enough for the whole road. Enough for Thursday. And then you come back Friday and ask again. Caleb's voice cracked just slightly. That's a hard prayer. It's the only honest one, Daniel said. But if the bread line was the mystery, the next line was the knife. And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Daniel found it on a Thursday, and it ruined him for a week. He'd always heard it as poetry. Nice symmetry. Parallel structure. Then he actually looked at the little word in the middle as, and realized it isn't decoration. It's a measurement. He brought it to the church that Sunday and did not soften it. "There are 7 requests in this prayer," he told them. "Only one of them has a condition attached. One, and it's this one." He held up the book. "Forgive us as we forgive." You just handed God the ruler. You just told him what to use on you. He watched 300 people do the math at the same time. "And you say it every week," he said. "Some of you have said it 4,000 times. Do you understand what you've been asking for? You've been standing in this room asking God to treat you exactly the way you treat the person you can't stand." Marjorie Klein put her hand over her mouth. "And in case anybody missed it," Daniel said, "look what Jesus does when the prayer's over. He finishes, 'Amen.' And then he doubles back, verse 14. He picks up one line out of 7, this one, and says it again harder. 'If you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses.'" He set the Bible down. He didn't come back for the bread line. Nobody breathed. "Now hear me," Daniel said, and his voice dropped. "This is not God being petty. This is God being honest. He's not saying you have to earn it. He's saying grace is not a thing you can hold in a closed fist. If your hand is clamped shut on what somebody owes you, it is shut. It's shut both ways. Nothing gets out, and nothing gets in. That's not punishment. That's plumbing." Ray Dawson, 4th row, said out loud, "Then I'm in trouble." And the whole church heard him. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "So am I, Ray," he said. "So am I." Because there was still a name in a dead woman's handwriting, in an address book on his kitchen table. His brother's name was Paul. The fight had been about money, about $11,000, and their mother's house, and who'd done what, while the other one wasn't there. 12 years ago. And Paul had come to Ellen's funeral, driven 6 hours, stood in the back, and left before the reception, and Daniel had seen him and said nothing. Not one word. Had let his own brother drive 6 hours and go home unspoken to. 4 years he'd carried that. He sat down that night and read the last 2 lines, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And Daniel, who'd spent 30 years telling people that faith makes you strong, read it and understood that Jesus ends the prayer by teaching grown men to admit they can't handle it. That's the last thing he gives them. Not victory, not confidence. A cry for help. He knew, Daniel said out loud. He knew we'd all get here, because that's the prayer of a man who has looked at the thing he needs to do and knows he doesn't have it in him. Which was at 11:40 on a Thursday night in Ohio, an exact description of Daniel Brooks. So here is the answer. Here is what a man in a small church in Ohio found at the bottom of the most famous prayer on earth. Jesus never gave the world a prayer to say. Every line is a demolition. Our takes your isolation. Father takes your orphanhood. Hallowed takes your self-importance. Thy kingdom takes your throne. Thy will takes your control. Daily bread takes your security. Forgive takes your grudge. Deliver us takes your pride. By the time you finish it honestly, once all the way through, there's nothing left of the man who started it. That's the thing nobody told them. That's why the prayer is short. It's not a poem. It's a surgery. And you cannot say it and stay the same. You can only recite it and stay the same. Millions do. Daniel had for 53 years. He picked up the phone at 11:52 p.m. He had the address book open. His hands were not steady. He dialed 6 digits and stopped, set the phone down, picked it up again. Then he prayed the shortest prayer of his entire life, and it wasn't eloquent, and nobody was watching, and there was no reward in it for anybody. He said, "Our Father," and then he dialed the 7th digit. It rang 4 times. Daniel counted every one of them. By the 3rd, he'd already started hoping for the machine. You could leave a message on a machine, you could hang up on a machine. And then there was a click, and a voice he hadn't heard in 12 years said, "Hello, older, rougher." But it was Paul. Daniel opened his mouth, and nothing came out. "Hello?" Paul said again. "Who is this?" "It's Danny." The silence on that line went on so long that Daniel checked the screen to see if the call had dropped. Then Paul said very quietly, "It's midnight. I know. Somebody dead." And that right there was 12 years in 4 words. That was what they'd become. The only reason his brother could imagine him calling. "No," Daniel said. "Nobody's dead." Another silence. "Then why are you calling me?" Daniel had rehearsed this. He'd had a speech. He was a professional. He'd built a career on knowing what to say. And every word of it went out of his head at once, and what came out instead was the truth. "Because I've been saying a prayer for 53 years, and I finally read it." Paul made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Is this a church thing, are you?" "You drove 6 hours." Paul stopped. "To Ellen's funeral," Daniel said. "You drove 6 hours and stood in the back, and I saw you. I looked right at you, and I let you drive 6 hours home without saying one word to you." His voice broke in the middle of it, and he let it. "Paul, I saw you." He heard his brother breathing. "I didn't come for you," Paul said finally. "I came for her." "I know. She sent me a Christmas card every year, 12 years every single year, and you never signed one of them." Daniel closed his eyes. He hadn't known that. He'd never known that. Ellen had kept writing to a man Daniel had erased, kept a door open in the dark for over a decade, and never once told him, and she'd taken it with her at 3:40 in the morning 4 years ago. "She never told me," he said. "Course she didn't." Paul's voice was thick. "She knew what you'd say." "Yeah." Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand. "She did. And then because there was nothing left to protect." "Paul, I'm not calling to fix it. I'm not calling to explain about the house or the money or Mom or who was there and who wasn't. I don't want to litigate it. I'm 53, and I'm calling my brother at midnight to say I've been standing in a pulpit for 19 years telling 300 people about forgiveness with you sitting out there in the dark, and I am so ashamed I can hardly hold the phone." He heard it then, the sound of a man on the other end of a phone. Line 6 hours away, 60 years old, crying and trying not to. "You want me to say it's okay?" Paul said. "It's not okay." "I know it's not." "You want me to say I forgive you?" "No," Daniel said. "You don't owe me that. That's not why I called." "Then what do you want, Danny?" And Daniel Brooks said the only thing he had. "I want to sit at the table with you. That's all. I don't need it settled. He said, "Our Paul." He said, "Our Father, and I can't get around it. I've tried. For 12 years I've tried, and it's in the prayer, and I can't take it out." Nothing. For a long time, nothing. Then Paul said, Is that really what it means? Yeah, Daniel said. That's really what it means. His brother was quiet another moment, and then, in a voice that sounded about 9 years old, he said, I've missed you so bad it's made me sick. They talked until 2:40 in the morning. They didn't solve it. That's the part people want and don't get. There was no moment where everything reversed, and 12 years fell away clean. They talked about their mother. They talked about the house badly and had to stop. Paul said something cutting, and Daniel took it. Daniel said something defensive and heard himself do it and said, That was wrong. I'm sorry. And Paul said, Yeah, it was, and they kept going. At 2:39, Paul said, I'm gonna hang up now. My hands are shaking. Okay. Danny. Yeah. Call me tomorrow. A pause. Don't do the 12 years thing again. Just call me tomorrow. And Daniel, sitting in a kitchen that had been silent for 4 years, understood something so clearly it made him laugh out loud after the line went dead. Give us this day, not the whole reconciliation, not 12 years healed in one night. Tomorrow's phone call, that's all. That's what God gives. Enough for today, and then you come back. He'd been asking for the storehouse his entire life. He'd wanted the whole thing fixed at once. The marriage explained, the death justified. The brother restored in a single conversation, and God had never once worked that way with anybody. Not in the desert, not with manna, not in Matthew 6. Enough for Thursday. Then you call again Friday. He told them that Sunday. All of it. He stood up in front of his church and told 300 people that he'd sat in the back of that room in October and heard them recite something perfectly and mean nothing, and that he'd been the worst offender in the building. I've got a brother, he said. His name's Paul. I hadn't spoken to him in 12 years. I called him at midnight on Thursday, and I'm calling him again this afternoon. He let that sit. And I need you to understand something, he said. Nothing's fixed. He's still angry. I'm still ashamed. We've got a whole mess to get through, and it might take the rest of our lives. But for the first time since 2013, we're at the same table. He looked out at them. That's what the prayer does. It doesn't fix your life. It seats you. Ray Dawson, 4th row, was crying openly and not bothering to hide it. Now here's why I'm telling you this instead of preaching, Daniel said. Because I could stand up here and explain epiousios to you, and you'd nod, and you'd go home and nothing would happen. I've been doing that for 19 years, so no more explaining. He came down off the platform and stood on the floor with them. Every one of you knows the name, he said. You knew it before I finished this sentence. You've had a face in your head since October, and you've been hoping I'd stop. Nobody moved. So say it with me, Daniel said. But I want you to say it slow. And when you get to the line about forgiveness, you know the one I want you to say that person's name in your head instead of the word debtors. Say their actual name. And if you can't get the words out after that, then don't say them. Because that's the first honest prayer some of you have ever prayed in this building. And 300 people said it. It took them almost 4 minutes. It was not beautiful. It came apart in the middle. Voices dropped out and came back. Somebody in the back got about halfway and just stopped and stood there with his mouth closed and didn't say the rest, and that man Daniel thought was the closest to God of anyone in the room. Marjorie Klein, 81, got all the way through it, and then sat down hard and said out loud to nobody, "Oh." Just that, just oh. Daniel knew exactly what that meant. Caleb's mother's biopsy came back on a Thursday. It was cancer. Stage 2 treatable. But it was cancer, and Caleb called him from the parking lot of the hospital and couldn't get a full sentence out. "I prayed for Thursday," he said. "Like you said, enough for Thursday." And Caleb was quiet a second. Then, "I'm still standing up." "Yeah," Daniel said. "That's what it looks like." "That's it. That's all I get." "Caleb," Daniel's voice was steady. "That's not nothing. You're on your feet in a hospital parking lot, and you're not alone, and you're going back in there. He didn't promise you a cure. He promised he'd be there when you asked. And you asked, and you're standing up." He paused. "Call me tomorrow." "Yeah," Caleb said. "Okay. That's the deal. Nobody wants it to be the deal. Everybody wants the storehouse. But 2,000 years ago, on a hillside outside Jerusalem, a carpenter's son looked at a crowd of exhausted, occupied, grieving, broke, terrified people who had every reason to walk away from God, and he didn't give them a strategy, and he didn't give them an army, and he didn't give them answers. He gave them 60 sick words. He gave them hour so they'd never be alone in the room. He gave them Father so they'd know what the word was supposed to mean. He gave them a kingdom to want more than their own. He gave them a will to fight for instead of surrender to. He gave them a word for bread that nobody has ever been able to define, so that they'd have to come back tomorrow and ask again. He gave them a condition on forgiveness because he would not let them hold a grudge and call it faith. And he ended it by teaching grown men to say, "I can't do this on my own." And here's the thing that ought to stop every one of us cold. Kings have prayed those words. Soldiers have prayed them in trenches with dirt in their teeth. Mothers have prayed them over hospital beds at 3:40 in the morning. Slaves prayed them in fields owned by men who prayed them in churches. People have whispered them in the last 10 seconds of their lives. It has outlived every empire that ever tried to bury it. Rome is gone. The prayer is not, because it was never a prayer to say. Jesus didn't hand the human race something to memorize. He handed us a way to live, a way to come home, a way to let go of what somebody owes you, a way to ask for enough and mean it, a way to stand up on Thursday when the news is bad and there's no cure coming. So here's the only question that matters, and it's yours now, not Daniel's. You know the words. You've known them your whole life. You could say them in your sleep, but somewhere out there is a phone number you haven't dialed. A name you've stopped saying. A door you've kept shut so long you've stopped noticing it's shut. And you cannot pray Our Father around it. There's no version of this where you get God alone. Pastor Daniel Brooks was 53 years old before he found that out. He'd been paid in full his whole life and never once been fed. Then one night in a kitchen with nobody watching, he said 2 words and dialed 7 digits. And for the first time since he was a boy, the prayer wasn't something he was performing. It was something happening to him. That's what Jesus gave the world on that hillside. Not a poem, not a ritual, not 66 words to fill the silence before dinner. He gave us a door, and it has been standing open for 2,000 years, and every single person who has ever walked through it started the exact same way with a name. They didn't want to say a phone, they didn't want to pick up, and 2 words that leave no room to hide. Our Father. Say it like you mean it, and it will cost you everything you were holding. Say it like you mean it anyway.